Good morning. We are honored today to have with us Minister Paulo Guedes, Brazil's Minister of the Economy. This is, of course, an understatement of his role. Prior to assuming office in President Jair Bolsonaro's administration in Brazil in January this year, they had consolidated, as I understand it, a number of portfolios into one sort of super ministry, including trade, including economy, including finance. And Minister Guedes decided that he was up to the task, which is a notable act of public service. And we admire always when economists are willing to stand up in their country and internationally and take on the burdens of leadership. Many of you know Minister Guedes in his private sector roles of distinction. Prior to becoming minister, he was co-founder of the investment bank BTG Pactual, and he was also involved with the think tank Instituto Millennium. It's always good to have people with think tank experience. It raises the boat for all the rest of us, so we're glad to have him here for that. Of course, Dr. Guedes has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, and it is also exciting to see in a sense, one of the progeny of the original Chicago boys coming back through to leadership in Latin America. So the minister has graciously consented to come to the Peterson Institute and talk about the new budget developments, the new domestic plans, and presumably also some of the international plans of he and the Bolsonaro administration. Afterwards, thanks to him, we will have an on-the-record exchange, first a few questions from me, and then to the media online with our live audience for a few minutes after that. Minister, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to have this short conversation at Peterson Institute. Have some friends here, and always appreciated the work of the think tank. Well, I've been here before, not here particularly, but I've been in the US some 6 months ago, and saying of how optimistic we were about the possibilities of implementing the reforms we announced during the campaign. And I might say that we are advancing at a reasonable speed. The Social Security reform was approved with a great fiscal potency and with popular support in the streets. Millions of people all over the capitals in Brazil shouting in favor of the reform, chanting in favor of the reform, and asking how we could help future generations if we got responsible, if we have a responsible behavior towards the public finance, and especially the Social Security. So the first and most emergent, the most important, we were threatened by a fiscal hole. Not only it was 750 billion reais every year, almost $200 billion of expenditures. But the most important thing about Brazilian expenditures is that not only the government was too big, but the quality of the expenditures was too low. When we went after it, the PET itself, 18% of GDP 40 years ago, then 22%, then 23, 24. When we opened politically, we made our glasnost. It went to 32, 36 at the end of the PSDB governments, and then the PT governments, 32, 34, 36, and public expenses reached 45% at the peak of Dilma's government. So when you come from 18% of GDP to 45% of GDP, in an uninterrupted expansion, uncontrollable expansion of public expenditures, all kind of misfunctions resulted. So at the end of the military government, with the guise of government, we spent too much, but financed by the recycling of petrodollars. This was the end of the 70s. So we began recurrent exchange rate crisis. Then the last military government was with the Figueiredo government. It was, again, expenditures outrunning taxes, but now financed by money creation. It was an open account in the budget through the central bank, what we call the monetary budget, Banco do Brasil lending money, subsidized money to agriculture, and the central bank monetizing those loans. And then we went to three-digit inflation. Then the civilians came and they frozen the symptoms instead of attacking the source of the problem. Prices were readjusted every year, then prices began being readjusted every month, then every week, then every day. And we run to 5,000% hyperinflation. Then the civilian government has frozen the prices. It didn't work, of course, because public expenditures were running out of control. Then we tried again, this time freezing financial assets, because people used to save for 2 years, then for 1 year, then for 1 week, then for the overnight. Brazil became the country of the overnight savings. Depending on the rate, you renew or not your saving, one day to the other, because inflation was 2,000%. So we did all kind of crazy plans trying to fight this uncontrollable public spending. Then eventually, in the mid-90s, we went for the real plan, a very bright plan on the monetary dimension, but a good economist knows that you need all dimensions. You need the fiscal and the monetary. If you have a fiscal loose and you tight money, you have interest rates of 70%. It's not an example, it is a fact. I was a banker at the time. Very glad to borrow money in the US at 3-4% a year and lend to the Brazilian government at 70% a year, 55% a year, 45% a year, 40% a year. 1 decade and a half of huge interest rates, huge taxes, to finally proclaim the victory against inflation. Internal debt came from 800 billion to 5 trillion reais, $1.5 trillion. Snowball indebtedness in the internal debt dimension. So all kinds of crazy things happen in Brazil because there was no stopping to uncontrollable expansion of public spending. So we knew that the first black hole to be faced was the Social Security. And then we made a major reform on Social Security. And then the second tower fell, which is the second most important expenditure in Brazil, which is interest rates. Brazil became hell to entrepreneurs and the paradise of rentiers. Why to have a company in Brazil? Why to invest in Brazil if you are paid 20%, 25%, 30% a year on your savings? So, like I said, when we began our program, we looked at we knew that we would have to change the fiscal regime. The fiscal regime has to change. We must control public expenditures. So the first tower to attack was 750 billion reais with Social Security. Next year, 50 billion more. Next year, 70 billion more. The thing was an exponential. It was not linear, it was exponential. So when we made this reform, we guaranteed that for the next 10, 15, 20 years, the whole trajectory, the future path of expenditure with Social Security collapsed. It is not exponential anymore. And then immediately long-term rates began going down. And if you calculate what happens to the service of the internal debt, interest payments every year, they collapse 100 billion in just a few months, just because we change into fiscal type this time. The equilibrium rate of interest changed, the neutral rate. The natural interest rates, like Fiscal or Milton Friedman or anybody else would call. Here you call it in monetary policy, the neutral rate. What is the neutral rate? So we changed the mix. So the first thing was the Social Security. The second thing was change the mix. Instead of easy fiscal and tight money producing very high interest rates, we put a tight fiscal and an easy money, quote unquote, not easy at all. Just the equilibrium rate collapsed because of the dynamics of the budget for the future. So 750 billion in Social Security, 400 billion. It was our yearly interest rate expenditures. It was $100 billion. $100 billion is the Marshall Plan. So Brazil rebuilds one Europe every year. The Marshall Plan was 8 years, 9 years, 10 years to rebuild Europe. Brazil rebuilds one Europe every year, just paying interest without getting out of poverty, and rebuilding one Europe every year just to service the debt. So not only we spend too much, 45% of GDP, but we spend too poorly. Because the first one, Social Security, a perverse transfer of income to privileged public officers that receive 20, 30, 40 times the minimum wage. And we were assuring through the Social Security these privileges. So we reformed that. When we did that, the second tower collapsed. Interest rates collapsed. Long rates came from 8, 9 to 6. And when you do the accounting, 100 billion less in interest service next year. It's 3 times the transfer that we call the Bolsa Familia to poor families, the 3-income transfer to poor families. So we spared 3 times more. So we can afford now to increase social programs and things like that for the future. As soon as the new fiscal regime consolidates itself. And then we went now for what we call the Federative Pact. It's like a book on an institutional framework for fiscal policy. This is a very important concept because Brazil does not have yet the law that gives independence to the central bank. The law is not there, but the practice is there, the culture of stability. And the monetary side we have, because we went twice to hyperinflation. So we know how it hurts. And even a poorly assessed government like Temer, because he was the vice president of an impeached president, so he climbed without political support. He was only 4% of approval and popularity. But he put inflation down from 11% to 4% because we had perfected a very important institution, the central bank. Central bank has an algorithm to fight inflation. It's the inflation target system. So even though we don't have the law, we have the culture and we practice it. And the fiscal side is the other way around. We have the law of fiscal responsibility approved in 1988, but nobody respects it. So municipalities are broken, states are broken, and the union was almost broken too. There was no culture. So our Federative Pact is as a matter of fact, is a transformation of the state. And this is a very important concept because you must understand that our economic structure was built under the military government. So the government was a machine to invest in infrastructure. The conception of the government is, in the 20 years of the military regime, the idea is, let's put the country to grow investing in infrastructure. Telebras, Eletrobras, Sidebras, Portobras, Nucleabras, all state companies, pretty much like in China or Soviet Union, you dominate certain single technologies like building dams, hydroelectric powers, roads, and you then create a machine of forced savings and you keep investing. This works for 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years. But then it derails because it does not have the intelligence, the capability to adjust to the future, which is what the US economy has. So when one sector is sinking, you have an innovation in the Silicon Valley and you reinvent and readjust and you have creative destruction. And market forces are recreating themselves all the time and they can adjust. So when we redemocratized the country, when we made our glasnost, Brazil and Russia made the glasnost. Brazil and Russia did not make their perestroika. Both went to hyperinflation, both went to moratoria, both corrupted their democracies, and both stagnated their economies. Because they did not transform the economic machinery. They just opened politically. And as they stretched funds to the new requirements of an emerging democracy, the quite acceptable, necessary claims, social claims of an emerging democracy. So it's very natural that when you open politically, you need money for education, health, sanitation, but you must cut subsidies to the big companies. You must cut the privilege for the public employees. You must cut subsidies in several sectors. If you extend funds to the new social, legitimate requirements of an emerging democracy, you must change your state machine, privatizing, opening the economy. And we didn't do it. That's why we went through hyperinflation, a lot of financial dysfunctions. But at the end, we corrupted our democracy and we stagnated our economy. Brazil was one of the fastest growing economies in the world for 3-4 decades. Brazil used to grow 7.4% a year, more than Japan, China, South Korea. The GDP of Brazil was the same size of China in 98, 99, 2000. And then we sunk as they integrated the global markets. So 3.7 billion people are getting out of misery, joining the global markets in the other side of the world. And you don't need even migrations anymore. It's the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Equalization of prices through trade and factor price equalizations. Wages go up for 3.7 billion, escaping from misery in the other side of the world. And wages don't go up in the western side of the world. And then the discomfort of Western civilization. Macron wins in France, then Brexit, then Trump here, and social discomfort. Of course, income distribution worldwide, a guy from Mars looking at income distribution, it never improved so much. Never so many people get out of misery. Never capitalism has done so much for so many people. But we in the Western world don't understand that. We're fighting against our very own sources of wealth. We don't understand why we are in trouble. I imagine in Brazil, with the transformation, because we lagged even this integration. As global markets in the last 20 years integrated themselves, the world economy was growing synchronized, 2005, 6, 7, more than 5%. through trade and integration. And Brazil remained closed for 40 years without effecting its perestroika. So we have a very clear agenda. Social Security was an emergency fixing of the fiscal side, and then let's transform the state. The Federative Pact is a book on fiscal sustainability. It's about the creation of a new institutional framework of fiscal awarenesses. So chapter 1, we create the Fiscal Council of the Republic, the President of the Republic, the President of the Senate, the President of the House, the President of the Supreme Court. All the guys with his decisions can destroy or sustain financial responsibility. They meet every 3 months, and there is a report on the State of the Union, like you have here, but all the federative entities of the Union. So it's about the creation of a new institutional framework. Chapter 2, let's give these guys tools. They need tools because all the money is stamped. It's quite understandable that in '88, when we wrote the new constitution, after we made our glasnost, because the military spent a lot of money on infrastructure, we wrote down in the constitution, we must spend in education, health. So we indexed all the budget. This was very nice. But 30 years later, is everything indexed? So the Brazilian politicians do not control 4% of our budget. It's not more than 4%. 96% is stamped. So wages go up, indexed. Benefits, social benefits go up because they're indexed. Expenditures in education, they go up because it's indexed. All the budget is indexed, 96% indexed. So they can do nothing. A governor is elected, a mayor is elected. He pushes buttons. There's nothing behind. He just keeps pushing buttons. When you just lift the table and look behind, there's nothing behind. It's just buttons. He keeps pushing. Brazil is run by a software. If they go home and sleep 1 year, nothing happens. There's a software running, sending money here, there, and everywhere. So the challenge is they must recover their responsibility for allocating public resources. So the first chapter is create a national council to monitor and examine the state of the union and the federative entities. Second chapter, give them tools. If a mayor or a governor is not able to control expenditures, he can decree, quote unquote, state of fiscal emergency, which means that it's a Brazilian shutdown. You know what is a shutdown? Americans just stop paying suddenly. It's the shutdown. We're not that tough like you are of shutting down. Shutdown, Brazilian shutdown is just don't give pay raises for a while. You pay everybody, you just don't let them have automatic wage increases. So you just freeze the wage bill for 2 years. If you freeze the wage bill for 2 years, because the economy will be growing 2.5%, 3%, and because there is 3.5% of inflation, revenues go up 8% 1 year, 8% the second. If revenues compounded go up almost 20% in 2 years, no fiscal crisis will take longer than 1.5 years. So Brazil, every entity of Brazil will have mechanisms, tools to control their expenditures. I did not invent this. This was built talking to mayors, talking to governors, talking to the Supreme Court, because they told us, listen, if I could at least control my expenditures here, 1 year, 1.5 years, I'm out of crisis. So we are giving them what they're asking us. And that's why I'm optimistic, absolutely optimistic about the reforms. They don't belong to us anymore. They were embraced by the Congress. The Congress embraced the reforms. They slice it. They're packaging it. They're dividing it. They're sponsoring it. They're building with us the reforms, how to transform the Brazilian state. So this new institutional framework has Chapter 1, the National Council to monitor finances of all entities. Chapter 2, how we can control expenditures. Then we add Chapter 3, how we decentralize revenues. A mayor or a governor not only can control his expenditures, but more than that, he will receive more money. The US is a federation built bottom up. You were 13 colonies, each one building its hospital, its church, its school, its police force. And then you had to fight the British because of the tax on tobacco. And then you create the federal government, the confederation. 30% of the money is upstairs, 70% is downstairs. If someone gets a gun and begins shooting here, in 3 seconds you have snipers and policemen and everybody, drop your gun now, slowly, and so on. If on the other hand you faint, in 3 minutes you have an ambulance, will take you to a public hospital, and again, you feel the presence of the state. In Brazil, all the money is upstairs. You can shoot up, the police does not come, they are afraid. If you faint, nobody gets, people will help you, but not the state. The public service will not show up there if you faint. So the money is not downstairs, the money is upstairs. The US was built bottom up. Brazil was top down. The friends of the king received pieces of land, the capitanias hereditárias, like we call, hereditary fields, and all the money is upstairs. So what we'll do, we cannot just get the money of the union now and transfer to state and municipalities. We can't do that. It is irresponsible. But we can do one thing. The most important oil companies in the world went down in Brazil. They looked at the prospects of the pre-salt, and they say there is something around 700, 800, up to $1 trillion in oil to come out of the ground in the coming 20 to 30 years. So our decision was, in the 3rd chapter of this book on the institutional fiscal framework for Brazil, Chapter 3 is about revenues. What we'll do is, and we did it already, this year we auctioned 2 fields and we raised 100 billion reals, $25 billion. It was less than that because 2 fields were not sold, the other 2 were sold, so we raised 70 billion reals. We'll distribute this money this year, 30%, 70%, exactly like it is today, 70% for the union and 30% for state and municipalities. But next year, all the revenues we have, royalties, auctions, bonuses, all the money, taxes that comes from this oil, we'll transfer 35% to states and municipalities. Next year, 45%, next year, 50%, next year, 55%. So in 8 years, we'll reach the new equilibrium state. 70% of all this money coming from the ground and under the sea will be for states and municipalities. So at the margin, we will build a true federation with more and more money being transferred to states and municipalities. So the central government will slow down its growth slowly. And the states and municipalities will grow faster in revenues for the next 8 years. The 4th chapter of this book is the devinculation, de-stamping of the funds. We have 280 funds. specific funds. Funds for, well, I wouldn't give you the list. You would not believe in the list. You would not believe. Because there was always a pirate from the private sector, always a creature of the political swamp, and always a corrupt bureaucracy to join together and how to steal public funds. So 280 funds were created. Of course, the major part of these were sound projects, but certainly a good part of it was plain robbery. But it doesn't matter the purpose. It's like Adam Smith. I don't care your real intentions. As long as the market works, you taking care of your intentions, you serve me, it's okay. So we'll make a cost-benefit analysis of each one of those 280 funds. In the next 2 years, some of them will die, some of them will merge, some of them will be discontinued, and so on. So we will devinculate this money. You have very wild cases in Brazil where in a poor city, in the hinterland, 30 years ago, you needed money for education. Families had 5, 6, 7 kids. Then it became in the hinterland of São Paulo, a wealthy city now. Middle class, established, families now with 1 kid or 2 kids. But you stamp the money for education. So you have to buy uniforms for the kids 6 times a year. Every 2 months you have to pay new uniforms for everybody, or you go to jail as a mayor. Because if you don't spend the money that is stamped, you're not fulfilling your social purpose of the fund, which is to expend that money. So the population grows older. There's no kids anymore. There's old people. You don't have ambulance for getting the old people. So a lot of money you miss. You need money for health, and you are squandering money buying uniforms in the other side. This was told to me by the mayors themselves. Please, if you have to keep the money stamped, at least stamp the compound, education and health. Instead of 10% and 10%, please stamp just 20%, because then I can move the money here, at least. So this is the kind of things we are addressing and sending to the Congress. Always remembering, Institutional Fiscal Framework is the name of the book. Chapter 1, Fiscal Council of the Republic, awareness, fiscal responsibility on the major actors. Chapter 2, tools for managers so that you can run and control your expenses. Chapter 3, revenues, more and more of Brazil, less and less of Brasilia. We are not a centrally planned. Of course, we are still, but we want to decentralize this thing. Chapter 4, administrative reform. Chapter 5, tax reform. Brazil is an asylum, is a one flew over the cuckoo's nest in taxes. 54 different kinds of tax. They accumulate. It's very, very inefficient. So we'll make a tax reform. Chapter 7, privatization, fast track for privatization. So all this is going through the Congress. And the Congress embraced the reforms. And they're studying it. And in the next 1 year, 1.5 years, they will be implemented. So we are optimistic about it. Particularly, we are digitalizing, people are retiring, we digitalize the services. Out of 97 services in Social Security, they were in presence. So you would have to get people to put in a truck to drive 100 kilometers to give a proof that you are alive so you could receive the benefit. Imagine a sick person, old person having to do it physically. When you have this thing here, you could do it all digital. So we are digitalizing everything. 20,000 people retirement. We didn't hire anyone. Productivity is going faster. Out of 97 services, 92 are already digitalized. So we are transforming the Brazilian state. It's a very painful work. It's very hard. What you hear abroad is, it is a mess, it's a social convulsion. And I always said, don't pay attention. It is a vibrant democracy, independent powers. We not only have center left anymore, we have center and right. It is a democracy. It's not just Democrats. It's Democrats and Republicans. It's labor and conservatives. You have everything now. It has never been so strong, the Brazilian democracy, never so powerful, vibrant, cooperative. There's no corruption scandals. Crimes drop at 20%. Average burning of forests slightly lower than in the last 10 years. We will not burn forests illegally. We will not stimulate we will finish, end illegal exploration, illegal deforestation, illegal burning of forests. We will stick to the Paris Agreement on environment. So all information has signal and noise. Most of you hear, what you hear abroad is noise. It's not the signal. It's not what is going on down there. Brazil is growing, it's taking off again. At the margin, we are already growing more than 2%. It is not much. Of course, it's just the double of what it has been. And it's just the first year. And we are just beginning. So in 3 months, we closed the Mercosur deal. It was 8 years, stuck for 8 years. In 6 months, we closed with the European Union. It was stuck 20 years since the Doha round, which was a failure in itself. Then we closed with the EFTA, European Free Trade Area. Now we are talking to Japan, to South Korea, and to Canada. China is going to Brazil and sounding us about the free trade area. We are talking to Trump, to Larry Kudlow, to Wilbur Ross, whom I met even before in our former lives. I met Wilbur Ross. He's a private equity man here. I was a private equity man down there. So we are going very smoothly, talking about seeking higher grounds. We want to integrate ourselves to the global chain, value creation. So we have no doubt, no hesitation about it. There's no case in history of a country that is growing a lot without integrating itself and expanding its trade and investment flows. The name of our program was The Road to Prosperity, just evoking the road to serfdom of Hayek, which I would call in the new version, the road to misery. Several of our neighbors are going in that direction. The last register was Venezuela, but there is a big, extensive list of people who play that game. And we put it together with the prosperity through competition. Ludwig Erhard, the guy who rebuilt Germany on competition, opening the economy, lowering taxes, integrating a common area, at that time, the European Common Area market. So that's it for the moment, and let's go for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Guedes, for choosing to give your remarks and your very up-to-date review of the reform program in Brazil. As you put it, the road to prosperity. There's a saying in the US, it's a little out of fashion now, but there used to be, people would talk about, give me that old-time religion. And you were giving us a version of the, in a sense, the old-time religion of reform. You're analogizing between the glasnost without perestroika of the end of the Soviet Union and Brazil in economic terms was particularly, to my mind, provocative. As you may be aware, some 30, 35 years ago, the Peterson Institute then published some work by John Williamson and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, which became known as the Washington Consensus.
Remember that.
And a lot of that, not without quite your passion and fervor, but a lot of that was in that volume. And since then, as the Institute and as the profession reviews things, we found that, unfortunately, the Washington Consensus tended to be the road away from perdition, but not necessarily the road to prosperity. So as many have observed, including our colleague Jose de Gregorio, we saw countries like Chile and Mexico, which pursued the list of reforms, clearly did better and were more stable than they had been in the past, particularly in the monetary front, but this did not lead to the leaps forward in productivity growth and GDP growth that people honestly ex ante hoped for. Do you think this is a misreading of the evidence, or do you think there's something different about how Brazil is going to do it? What do you think is, I understand you're trying not to overpromise and this takes time, but what do you think is the upside from these reforms besides avoiding skyrocketing debt?
We are at the very beginning of a process. There is a book, Barriers to Riches, Wallace.
Yeah.
And saying that, listen, you can even produce some short-term miracles. Just getting out of the obstacles that we create themselves with a lot of bad regulation that prevents us from absorbing established techniques and established deals and established ways of doing business all over the world. So it's a very interesting book because it says, listen, you are quite inside your production efficiency frontier, the transformation curve that gives you the possibilities, the fiscal possibilities, if you had an efficient allocation of factors of production. So I have no doubt Brazil has such high taxes on labor that 40 million people are out of the labor market. So they have very low productivity. They can't get jobs because you tax too much the labor force. A country that is plenty of labor force and cannot use that because you are overcharging, taxing wages. It's a perverse, cruel taxes. And then 40 million people are here with low productivity. If they just join capital and technology in the formal labor market, you begin increasing productivity. So removing inefficiencies like this, and we have plenty of them, you could even produce a miracle, growth of 3.5%, 4% for a period. Then this is the first kind of gain. Then you have the more substantial gains that come from the Washington Consensus at that time, which was exactly to reinforce the gains from trade, the gains from efficient tax structures, textbook cases of allocating better resources, of relying on a better market system. They're there. But of course, this is not all. This is not all. You have the main sources of wealth, which are education, technologies that come from education. So they don't come that much anymore, like in old times, from the quantitative accumulation of factors, but the quality of these factors. One thing is absorb labor, unqualified labor, give him a job with more technology around him. This is good, this increases his productivity. But what about giving him even more quality with education? Same thing with physical capital. What about giving them technologies, new dimensions, digital technology, robotic surgery, things like that. So of course, to really grow forever, sustainably, takes much more. This is the story of the US trying to keep ahead of the Western civilization. When certain sectors collapse, they reinvent themselves with the Silicon Valley. But not all of the population follows. Most of the population is under the Stoper-Samuelson. The wages can't go higher because we can produce it cheaper anywhere else. So the political constituency here is under check because they cannot deliver. If you cannot deliver here, imagine the president of Spain or Portugal. You don't control your currency, you don't control the flows of people, you don't control the integration of it. You control anything. You don't control anything. You control only the quality of your public policies. If you practice good public policies, you have a better chance to integrate.
Well, that's, in a sense, that's really fascinating. That, in a sense, is exactly the point. That Spain had very good productivity growth and improvement before the Euro crisis. Spain has returned to the top rank of growers and productivity in Europe after recovery from the crisis. And that was despite all the supposed fiscal sins of Spain. And in fact, we had Marco Butti, the longtime Director General of ECOFIN at the European Commission, give a speech here a couple of weeks ago in which he talked about how there had been too much emphasis on the fiscal side in the recovery in Europe. So I guess what I'm wondering is, you made a very compelling case about the Social Security reform, the interest saved, which is a huge accomplishment. How is that money being mobilized, either by the private sector or the public sector, to promote growth? You've shrunk the public sector, you've shrunk public debt. Where over the next 3, 4, 5 years should we be seeing the benefits?
This is a critical aspect of it. And we were really observing because it is not simple. It is the crowding in. For 40 years, we crowded out private investment with very high interest rates, very high taxes. So private investors either became rentiers or they went abroad, like human capital. Mm-hmm. Brazil used to be an absorber of immigrants. When we were growing 2, 3, 4 decades at 7.3 average growth for 2, 3, 4 decades, Brazil is the first colony of Japanese outside Japan, second colony of Italians outside Italy, third colony of Germans outside Germany, absorbing people from all over the world. Now it's the other way around. Brazilians go everywhere. Researchers, poor kids, better to deliver a pizza in Boston or to wash dishes in Barcelona than unemployed in Brazil. So it is a dramatic situation of a very wealthy country in terms of natural resources, but a country that does not know how to appropriate this, how to transform this in prosperity because of the hostility toward the private sector. Yeah. They believe that the government creates wealth, and they keep pushing it to the limit of hyperinflation, external debt moratorium, snowballing indebtedness, always believing that the next turn it will work. It does not work. It did not work. So in spite of very important accomplishments of putting poor people in the federal budgets, which is an accomplishment of the social democracy, all this is very respectable. Nothing against it. Milton Friedman was in favor of the voucher for education, is in favor of the minimum income, the basic income. If you want to help the poor, transfer income directly to his pocket. Don't let the organisms, the mechanism to absorb this, because they will eat 90% of it and transfer only 10%. So we applaud many social policies, but we don't accept the wrong hypothesis that the government is the driver of growth, because it never has been. We saw the Soviet Union collapsing, and we are now reading a book by Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize in Economics, the Coase Theorem, the guy of the Coase Theorem, business law man, how China became capitalist. How China became capitalist. The hypothesis, there are two Chinas. One is imploding, is the socialist China. Broken banks, collapsing credit, empty cities with dogs fooling around in buildings, empty buildings all over. And then the capitalist China, free of taxes on labor, wage taxes, income taxes, no social security, no labor laws, exporting all over the world and growing. One grows 15%, the other collapses 9% net is 6. China is growing 6. But look at behind the curtain what is going on down there.
Actually, yeah, our colleague Nicholas Lardy's book on The State Strikes Back paints not quite as dire, but a similar picture to you, that all the growth is coming from the private
So
sector.
in Brazil, we are now waiting for this moment. What can I tell you now?
Yeah.
Public credit is contracting in real terms because we are doing it. We are making sure we are deleveraging public banks. We are deleveraging because the federal government borrowed a lot to capitalize these banks. Lending, not capitalized. They made loans to these banks. And these banks lend money to Cuba, to Venezuela, to the private pirates who are sacking money from Brazil. So we are deleveraging these banks and forcing them to pay back to the union. So we're reducing federal debt. That's why interest rates are collapsing too, because we are decelerating sharply the rate of indebtedness. And then interest rates began collapsing. Health, sanitation, transports, all these infrastructure, and because health to me is investment in human beings, in human capital. So certainly, you need to invest a lot, all kinds of investment, public and private. We need that. So when interest rates were 15, 20%, they remained decades in 2 digits. There was no investment, private investment on this. Now that in only 1 or 2 years, rates collapsed to 4, 5, 6%, all these infrastructure have interest rates or targets of 8%, 8.5%, 9%. These waves of investment are being triggered now. So for the first time in the last 10 years, private credit is more than public credit, stock and flow. And then the country now is growing 2%. So we are better now. We were growing 1% on unsustainable public finances and credit. Now we're growing 2%, contracting public credit and expanding naturally the private credit. We are auctioning 20 airports last year, 12 airports last year, 20 airports coming year. Ports, airports, roads, everything.
So we're watching for the private investment boom. You also made and took legitimate pride in the conclusion of the Mercosur negotiations and of the EU-Mercosur FTA negotiations, and mentioned, if I heard you correctly, about how the role of trade and foreign investment in the development of economies is critical, and you've mentioned that with respect to China. So what are the prospects for bringing EU-Mercosur to ratification in the Congress in the near term? And how you have in the past made some remarks that were not entirely positive about Mercosur. What is your agenda with respect to Mercosur?
Well, I remember that there was a misunderstanding at the beginning of the mandate of the president. When I gave an interview, it was exactly in the day of the election of the president. The president was elected. We were at his house. It was 10 at night. The result of the election came. President Bolsonaro is the new president of Brazil. I congratulate everybody and I said, I'm going home. They stayed partying 1 hour, 2 hours more, and I immediately came back home. When I was getting out, there were like 5,000 people around the house in the neighborhood, thousands of people. I crossed a crowd. I went to a hotel to call an Uber. When I sat down to make the phone call, like 50 newsmen surrounded me. And then I felt sorry because I said, Jesus, these guys are waiting for news. The news are not coming because the guys will stay there partying 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. And the newspapers will close soon enough. They need news. I'll give them news. I'll talk to them. Big mistake. Big mistake. I always try to, and it's a big mistake because I stopped there and then I was trying to explain, listen, our priority is expenditures. The government has been spending too much money. We must control them. The newswoman of, I think it was Clarín.
But looking forward, what is your agenda with Mercosur, and will you be bringing EU Mercosur to the Congress?
She said, Mercosur. I said, calm. Mercosur, calm. Mercosur, it is not the priority.
That's fine. So what is the priority now?
It is not the priority. No, it is not the priority. With respect, or compare it to the Social Security. It's not that it is not important. I'm talking to 49 Brazilian newsmen trying to convey the message to Brazilians.
That is in the past.
And then
What
there
is
is
the
an Argentinian
prospects
there.
now?
Same thing here, Mercosur. It's very important to us. We are seeking higher grounds. We are expecting them to go with us ahead with the European Union. What is my expectations? That they follow with us.
Fine.
This is my expectation. They follow with us. It's reasonable. They should. It's important to them. They lost, like us, 10 years, 20 years with closed economies. I hope they come with us. This is my expectation.
And so do you have a schedule for bringing it to the Congress?
To our Congress?
Yeah.
Well, it's there already. In Brazil, they know we closed the deal. Everybody's happy about it. We're just follow on with all the reforms. Like I said here, a lot of reforms going on. Our Congress is fully supportive of this.
Cool.
Fully supportive of it.
That's good news.
Yes, fully supportive of it.
That's great.
And we have no problems with the new president of Argentina whatsoever. As long as we are seeking higher grounds together, no problem whatsoever.
Cool. I didn't even ask about that. That's great.
Yeah.
Final question before I turn it over to our audience, and thank you for making time to have the exchange. On the other side of the Atlantic, some people in the EU have spoken about holding up EU Mercosur due to issues with the Paris Agreement and the treatment of the Amazon. Both specifically, where do you see that going? And more generally, does the Bolsonaro government recognize any grounds for international discussions of the situation in the Amazon, or is that solely a national issue?
I think there is a lot of misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is caused by political interests, political disagreements, which should not be the case. We should respect when a people elect a president anywhere in the world. We should respect the preferences of the people instead of second-guessing the result of a democratic election. What kind of democracy is this that only one side can win? If people are supportive of the thesis of the ideas that President Bolsonaro put during his campaign, what is the problem? So if we remove these ideological barriers or poisons, and we look practically at what happened, Brazil has the cleanest energy matrix in the world. Cleanest. Nobody has preserved so well forests like us. Nobody. Everybody burned their forests. They're going after whales, exterminating even Indians and ethnics. So I don't feel it's reasonable. People behave toward Brazil, a sovereign state, like we were a bunch of irresponsible guys.
Very clear.
If you burn your forest, if you kill your Indians, if you don't preserve your forest, then you say, you cannot do that, you cannot. Who said we are doing that? Have you ever thought that we are a poor country and we don't have funds to preserve 8,000 of frontier, 8,000 kilometers of frontier? Did you ever thought of that? Do you think we are on purpose burning things? We are against illegal deforestation. We are against illegal mining. We are against burning forests. We are in favor of the Paris Treaty. This is us. But there are people talking things that it's not what we talk. Well, but the president, no. The president said, listen, Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, is a Brazilian territory. Would anyone disagree with this? Would anyone claim a right of control? Would you support an international intervention force to surveil the Amazon? Would you? Or do you think it's our territory? I would like to know your opinion on that.
My opinion is there's no conflict between the two.
Oh, I like that approach. I like that.
No, but
It's exactly what I think. There's no conflict. We are in favor of carbon credits. We are in favor of stimulus and funds to preserve, to help us to preserve, so that we not indulge in the same guilty that you guys had to destroy when you run to the West and face the Indians and kill Indians. We don't want to do that.
I completely agree, and I think the
That's
reparations.
a great idea.
Some of the reparations the U.S. government and our U.S. people should make. This is expressing my opinion.
Help us to preserve it.
To preserve should be to pay for that, since we spent so much money killing other people and killing our forests.
Yeah, that's it.
I completely
in wars
agree.
And everything else. That's true.
I completely agree.
So we completely agree. And more than that, we ask people also to preserve them. Well, I'll tell you later.
Okay. Let me, the minister's been very patient with me, and the audience has been very patient. Let me now open it up. We have, of course, reporters from Brazil and around the world here. This is being streamed live on the internet. The video and transcript of the minister's remarks will be publicly available on our website permanently. But we're here for the live audience to ask questions. Please try to make it brief. Identify yourself when speaking. We have a roving mic up front, and we have a standing mic at back. So first this gentleman in the front, and then the lady at the mic there. First this gentleman.
Minister, thank you very much for your time. My name is Tony Quintanilla. I'm with EY. Investors are very much happy about some of the structural reforms that the government is trying to implement. However, there's still a couple of concerns in certain areas, especially in light of recent events. And two I can think of off the top of my head are the commotion going on in the rest of the region. What is the government doing to make sure that Brazil isn't tainted by what's going on in the rest of the region, doesn't scare investors away? And the second one is currency risk as it relates to investments in infrastructure. Is the government planning on implementing any hedging instruments to make sure that, to address those concerns?
Good questions. First, with respect to democracies, they're noisy. They make noise. I'm very concerned about people who are not in the street in Venezuela. I don't see them in the street anymore. I'm very concerned about people who can't go to the street peacefully, because to destroy things is crime against private property, against things like that. But peacefully, what you're seeing, part of it is entirely reasonable. People go to the street, ask for things. Democracies are noisy. We respect and we value freedom. People have the right to go to the street peacefully and make noise, complain, say things, chant, whatever. There's no problems with public manifestations. Of course, the political intelligence and the politicians make their calculations. Should I go ahead with this reform? People are complaining. Take the case of Chile. People went to the streets. What are they complaining against? Well, the economic model, the neoliberal economic model. Well, you had 6 social democrats or socialist presidents. Why didn't you change it? Complaining against what? You run the country successfully for 20 years, in sequence, 25 years. Piñera is the only guy who's not a socialist there. And then suddenly you discover that you don't like the model. I think we should practice responsibly democracy. If you run 6 times, 7 times, you run the country, you don't change the model, what are you complaining against? Do you know how to play democracy? Wait the next election and do the changes you want to do. You don't have to break the whole city down. So, this is what I think of this noise. I think it is bad for the region. I think it scares investors. I don't think this is intelligent, even for the opposition. I think it's very stupid. because you are impoverishing your own people. People from abroad look at us differently already, is what I think. And I understand that. Why are the Europeans so concerned about if we are doing bad things to Indians and everything? It's very natural. After killing each other for centuries, last century they killed 100 million among themselves in world wars and things like that. It's very natural that they don't want violence anymore. So they look at us and say, hey, we don't like you to kill each other. We say, okay, we learn, we see you doing it. It was not good at all. That's why we received a lot of immigrants here. They were not happy living there. So we carefully listen to what you're saying. We are mindful of that. We cannot burn the forest. We cannot illegally invade properties and do wrong things. We are respectful of the biosphere. We would love if you guys here, for instance, took a desert like Nevada, Las Vegas, and transformed a desert in the world capital of entertainment. This is wonderful. Imagine having the same thing in the Amazon region: mystery, tourism, entertainment, and World Center for Sustainable Energy. Beautiful. Help us on that. So we are open for that. And I think that it is entirely understandable people going to the streets, like all over Latin America, peacefully and complaining. But we are not naive. If you have 6, 7 governments in a row, and then when the opposition is elected, you begin disturbing and breaking things on the street, you should look at that thing with a different eye. What are these guys doing? So in Brazil, we have 8 governments, social democrats. And now we have 6 months in the new government. What are you complaining of? A lot of unemployed people. Us? A lot of poverty. Us? It's 30 years under you. What have I done in 10 months to make your life so poor? Forgive me. Let's play the democratic game correctly. 3 years from now, you come back and you win the election. Simple as that. So what I ask from you is just understanding, not falling in love passionately with one side. This is not democracy. Democracy has both sides, and they complement each other.
Any comment on the exchange rate hedge?
On the exchange rate, when we talk to foreign investors, 3 risks. Number 1, they always say, it is the regulatory risk. We know we want to move in and we don't want interventions. Second, exchange rate. And third, it used to be the first, now is the third, the political risk, uncertainties and things like that. It used to be the first. Brazilian democracy is a vibrant democracy, like I said, independent powers. Even the conventional media, when they fell in love with one candidate, the social media elected somebody else with less than $1 million of expenditures. Huge third market in the world in digital penetration, Brazil. So talking to Israel is at the frontier in digital innovation, but they don't have scales. We have a scale. So associate with them, they try products in a huge market with digital penetration. So this is the way we are going. So with respect to your specific question, exchange rate, solve it. We have that. We don't need a capital gain for the central bank. As the money flows in, we can sell an exchange rate clause. It's already designed so that we remove this risk. You want to make 8% dollar-wise, you want to invest, no problem. By the time, because it's really very bad if you are there for 10 years making 8%, by the time you are going to send your money back to your country, exchange rate in a turmoil goes up and you lose that. And then our central bank has a capital gain. I don't want this capital gain. Same thing if the capital gain is yours. By the time you were going to develop to send back your money, You made a 50% killing gain because exchange rate collapsed. No problem. You won't have it either. This time it's ours. So if we had a convertible currency, we are going in that direction. We will have a convertible currency 5, 6 years down the road. If you have a convertible currency, no problem. You don't have it. You don't have future markets. We can provide that exchange rate hedge mechanism.
I regret that I've gotten the signal that the minister must get to his next meeting. I apologize for not getting to the audience questions sooner. And I'm sorry we lost that opportunity, but please join me in thanking Dr. Paulo Guedes, the Minister of Economy, for presenting.